best turnout yet, other than the first day. All right, so if I don't call your name, or if I do call your name, that means that you're not here. So if I call your name and you're here, let me know. Carr here? No? Okay. You have done that. Sorry, it's done that in the system. Smith, not here. Davis is here. Carr, Mark, Newton, Cunningham, Faulkner, Stanley, Whitaker, Strickland is here. Fisher, Sims, Littell. That's it. Of course, if you're online and I called your name, don't worry about it because you're just going to do the regular old attendance. Send me the attendance word sometime before 9 a.m. It's 7:59, so I won't do the attendance word yet. I don't have much right now, but it's just a reminder that lab's online today, or excuse me, lab's in person today, but it will be an online lab, so make sure you bring your computer. My plan for office hours is to go in and actually look to see who's done it. I know at least one of you's done it. So, you know, if you've done it and you're like, well, I haven't got an email yet, keep an eye on your email. Because I'm going to go take a look after class today and hopefully get those taken care of. So if you've done it, then probably you won't have to come in today. So that's it for lab. Does anybody have questions about lab? All right, I got a great question about independent work. Somebody was asking, you know, why are they getting the grades they're getting? Great question. Feedback is great because especially with independent work, the idea here is to have conversations, even if it's via text. So if you're ever wondering why you got the grade you got, read, because I always leave a little comment. Like I'll highlight a little portion that gave you the grade, and I'll leave a comment. So you missed 1 point for grammar or typing errors, or this doesn't count at all because the link you shared was not a link to a source, it was a link to your search, things like that. So make sure you look at those and come to me if you need help, because I would love to talk to you about your papers. It's great. What else? I guess that's it. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
You can change it, right?
Yeah, for example, like, that's a great question. So if you send something in and I'm like, I can't grade this because this link is not a proper link, that's just a mistake, right? So then you could just take that, copy and paste what you did into a new document, fix the link and resubmit it. Yeah, nothing's ever permanent. That's the beauty of independent work. First of all, yes, you can change it. And two, you can always just move forward, right? It's never like, you only have so many assignments you can turn in before you hit 100, right? You just keep turning in until you hit 100. So it's like a no pressure kind of situation, other than the fact that if you're not doing many yet, then you are under a little bit of pressure because you have less than half the semester to get them done now, which makes it a lot harder, twice as hard as when we started. Any other questions? All right. Don't forget the exam. No one's really given me any feedback. I mean, I need to read some emails from last night, but no one gave me any feedback yet, I think, about exams. So sometime between now and tomorrow, I'll make a decision on when the exam's going to be and let you know. And like I said, on Monday, if I say the exam's going to be next week and you want to take it earlier, that's fine. Let me know. We can make arrangements for you to take it. You can always take it earlier. Earlier is not a problem. Later is when things get a little bit problematic because then you have more time to prepare than your classmates, and that's not fair for your classmates. Anyway, any other questions?
So you did, for the final, you take the last couple chapters, and then you also take questions from the first exams.
Yeah.
So I missed some on the second exam,
Mhm.
and I know some people are still taking possibly that second exam.
Yeah.
When will I be able to get feedback?
Shoot. Well, we can meet online. If anytime you want to meet online, I'll give you feedback. That way we're discussing it, you know?
So, because I'd like to know what I need to study,
Okay.
you know what I mean?
Shoot. Yeah, and that makes it harder for other people. I'll just do it. I'll just give you feedback. Have you retaken it yet? Have you done the retake?
I'm not going.
Okay. All right. You don't have to, but remember, it's good practice, and grade can't go down. But anyway, yes, I'll go in and give you feedback, and then I'll just have to trust you that you won't give away the answers. All right. Any other questions? That was a good one. All right. Before we get started, I feel like somebody's turned us on to 85 because it was a little bit chilly outside. And somebody around here actually cranked it up to 85 when it gets a little bit chilly. You see. Oh yeah. Why not? did down into the 60s yesterday. I might as well crank the thermometer up to 85. Whew. Anyway, let's get back to chapter 13. We were talking about evolution. Specifically, we were talking about Darwin, kind of giving you his story of how he came to know what he knew. Even though I'm not going to test you on the timeline of it, it is interesting to learn it, how he learned it, because it really helps you understand. Sort of like the same way your textbook did it with Mendel. So again, remember, we're talking about Darwin. He's on this long journey that he left for when he was 22 to go around the world on the HMS Beagle. And the purpose of the HMS Beagle was to basically make maps. So he was seeing a lot of the world and stopping in a lot of places. So we're talking about his observations now. His observations, so this is going to be important. This will be at very least a study guide question, maybe a test question. His observations indicated that the geographic proximity is a better predictor of relationships among organisms than the similarity of their environment. Meaning, using South America as an example. You know, if he's looking at South America, which he did because he went all over South America, and he's looking at like the mountains of South America versus the desert of South America, right? Completely different environments, but they're in South America. The relationships among those organisms, he found they were closely related. Closer than if you were to look at the deserts of South America versus the deserts of Africa, right? So it wasn't the environment that had the biggest impact, if you will. It was more their closeness, geographic. That was one of the first things he observed. Don't get me wrong, environment does play a role in it, and we'll talk about that later. But we're talking about what he was figuring out. This is what he first observed. I'm trying to explain the things he observed that led him to his hypothesis, which eventually became a theory. Because remember, in the steps of science, right, scientific method observation, that's the first step. So, any questions about that? Again, geographic proximity is more important in this context than similarity in environment. All right, more specifically, also, the South American fossils that he found, although there were clearly examples of species that were different from living ones, were distinctly South American in resemblance to living plants and animals of that kind. In other words, he found all these fossils on South America. He looked at them. He could tell by looking at them and looking at the things that were still alive that they were clearly different. They clearly weren't the same species. However, he also could tell that even though they weren't related, they weren't the same species, he could tell they were related, right? There was something similar about them. For example, does anybody know what this is? No? No guesses? How about that? Nothing? Okay. How about that? Good. I'm glad someone finally guessed one. Yes, it looks a lot like a llama, right? Anyway, if you're familiar with animals, hopefully you might guess a llama there, or a capybara, or an iguana, or a toucan. That's what they look like, but it turns out they're not. And that just gets back to what he was saying, which is that he found these are like representations of fossils he found. So he found fossils of things that looked a lot like a llama, but were not a llama. But they looked like a lot like a toucan, they were not a toucan. Those are just examples. I can ask you about those animals. Anyway, speaking of which, maybe the first word for attendance, just say animals. So let's see a bunch of animals that we're talking about. Animals is the first word for attendance if you are online. So anyway, again.
What word is that? I couldn't hear you.
Animal.
Animal. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for asking. So yeah, we'll talk about all these animals. He said, again, geographic proximity more important than similarity of environment. And this bullet point is basically saying, not only is that true for everything alive that he saw, but it also was the case when he compared the fossils. Darwin was also very intrigued by the distribution of organisms on the Galapagos Islands. I told you we would talk about these, and I'm going to try not to spend too much time talking about it, but let's talk about why they're so important for what he figured out, right? First of all, they're relatively young. Like I mentioned earlier, on Monday, they're volcanic islands, meaning they came around a lot, way after the mainland South America, right? So they basically were born, if you will, right? So there was South America, the big chunk of land of South America. It existed for a long time. And then eventually, we had some volcanoes and we had some islands, right? Also, they're about 550 miles off the Pacific coast. I don't want to ask you any of this. I'm not going to ask you how far it is, but that number is kind of important, not the exact number. But the point here is the Galapagos Islands are far enough away from the mainland of South America that things aren't just leaving South America and going to the islands, right? Birds aren't just flying over there. Animals that can swim aren't just swimming over there. It's too far for that to happen on a regular basis. However, it is close enough to where if there's some sort of freak occurrence, like maybe a hurricane or something, right? Something that could allow life to eventually leave South America and come to the Galapagos Islands, they can't have them happen on occasion, right? So it's close enough to where it can happen, but it's far enough away where it doesn't happen often. So because of that, most animals that you find on the Galapagos Islands, you can find nowhere else on Earth. But they do represent some South American species. Reason being is because, again, you had all these South American animals and plants that eventually left South America when the time was right, right? So it didn't happen often. And some of them made their ways to those islands. And those islands are very distinct and different than mainland South America. So whatever organism left, let's say it was a bird, some bird left South America, or a few birds, and they made it to the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are a lot different than South America. So of those few birds, if one of them was better equipped to handle the islands, right? Better adapted to those islands, then that one's going to survive and pass along its genes, and then the species is going to start looking like that, and over time, we're going to have natural selection, right? And that's what you guys know from the dark cutting box. So that's exactly what happened here. Not just with birds, but many, many animals. So yeah, try not to keep it too long, or try not to make it too long. They did a pretty good job. You get it now, right? It's the distance. That distance is like the sweet spot. Far enough away to where, again, if a bird makes it there, it's not breeding with birds on South America. It's just there. They're their own population. They're doing their own thing. They're not influenced by South America. It's far enough away to keep that from happening. But again, close enough to where occasionally it can happen. I will give you some examples. Darwin noticed that the Galapagos marine iguanas were different than the ones in South America and any other ones that he'd ever seen because they had flattened tails, right? So that's a Galapagos marine iguana. They have flattened tails that aids them in swimming, which makes sense because on the mainland of South America, they're probably not doing much swimming, right? You have this huge continent to live on. But if you're living on a bunch of tiny little islands, it helps to be able to swim from island to island. That's just an example. He also noticed that each island had its own distinct variety of tortoise. And this also makes sense too. I'm going to put a big X to this because I'm not going to ask you any questions about it. But it would make sense that if you went to all the Galapagos Islands, the iguanas were about the same, right? Because there wasn't like an iguana population on this island and an iguana population on that island, and they were distinct from each other. No, they could swim from island to island. The tortoises, these huge tortoises, on the other hand, couldn't. So you had a population of tortoises on this island, a population of tortoises on that island, and they didn't interbreed, right? They were doing their own thing. They had their own environment to deal with. So because of that, over generations and generations and generations, they evolved into different species. So those are just two great examples. There's a lot of other examples you can look up if you want to for independent work. There's a newer study, and I don't think this version of your textbook talks about it, but finches, like these birds, and they've actually seen, like in their 20-year study, they saw evolution to the natural selection in action. So they saw the beaks of these birds change as the weather changed. Anyway, if you download the PowerPoint, there's some videos you can watch about the marine iguana or the Galapagos tortoise. Here's a picture of a domed shell tortoise. I forget which island it lives on, it's not important. And then there's a picture of a saddleback tortoise, and it lives on a different island. Again, you can tell where they are. I mean, if you know these things, you can tell which island they live off of based on what species they are. Again, those things are not swimming from island to island. Populations of tortoises are separate from each other. They're not interbreeding. That'll be very important later in the chapter. All right, so any questions about his observations? All right, then let's talk about these new insights. What did his observations lead to? All this stuff he looked at, thought about, wrote down. While he was on his voyage, he was also strongly influenced by a book called Principles of Geology by a guy named Charles Lyell. You could click on that link if you download the PowerPoint and read a little bit more about him. Keep in mind, this is in the 1800s, so there were still a lot of people who thought the world was 6,000 years old, and there still are, but even more so back then. So this book was kind of new information. We know that the world is older than 6,000 years now. We have plenty of proof for it. But back then, that was still a new idea. And this book was some of the new evidence that proved it. Because it said that the Earth is ancient. It was sculpted over millions of years by gradual geological processes that continue today. Even though he didn't use this example, I would throw out the Grand Canyon, right? That's obviously millions of years old. The Appalachian Mountains, since we live here, used to be the tallest mountains in the world. Back when South America, Africa hit, right? North America and Europe, they all hit. That's what caused the mountains. But over millions of years, they've now been downgraded, right? We don't have time to talk about that, which we did. Anyway, so he's reading this book. He's strongly influenced by it. Also, he got to witness some things. He witnessed the power of natural forces that change Earth's surface. Specifically, he was in an earthquake. I think he was on a boat, but either way, he witnessed an earthquake, and it raised the coastline in about a meter, so about 3 feet. He was there, earthquake happened, and then immediately, the rocks were 3 feet more out of the water. So he figured, if I saw that in a matter of seconds, and of course over millions of years, you're going to see a lot of change on Earth. So again, all this to say, I'm going to put a big X to it because I'm going to test you on it. I'm just letting you understand how he came to figure out what he figured out. So he saw those things about the plants and animals that we talked about earlier. And now I'm saying he's starting to believe and understand, okay, the world must be older than 6,000 years old. I'm influenced by this book. I'm seeing things that are helping me believe that. So then upon his return to England, he reflected on his observations. He analyzed the specimen collection and he discussed work with his colleagues. He actually did it for a while. If you want to look up the details for independent work, you can. It's not like he just showed up to England and was like, hey, here's natural selection. He marinated on it for a while. And after doing so, he concluded that present-day species are descendants of ancient ancestors, which they still resemble in some ways. So that one bullet point is the one where a lot of people, when they say they don't believe in evolution, that's what they don't believe in. So that's the contentious one, right? So you could, again, evolution, natural selection happens. We see it happening. That's without a doubt that happens. So that's the part that I think some people don't believe in, and that's fine. I'm not here to change your mind, but yes, he's now saying that things have not always been this way. We came from ancestral species. And over time, these differences gradually accumulated by a process he called descent or modification. He also proposed a mechanism for how this happened, and this is where natural selection was born, right? That's what natural selection is. And the book definition for natural selection is that individuals with certain inherited traits are more likely to survive and reproduce than individuals with other traits. And then obviously, like if you were really explaining natural selection, that would only be a part of it. Not only do they survive, but what does that lead to? Their survival leads to, or the survival and the reproduction leads to their offspring having those traits. And then again, the species changing as time goes on. So anyway, any questions about this slide? All right, the next word for attendance, let's say, is time. It's right there. Time is the next word for attendance. So no questions? All right.
You said time?
Yep, the one that's circled. I know it's hard to hear because the room was 85 degrees and I was cooling it back down to a nice cold 72 degrees. So again, we're talking about his return to England and after he thought about things and specimens and talked to people. He hypothesized that as descendants of remote ancestors spread into various habitats over millions and millions of years, as opposed to just 6,000, right? Natural selection resulted in the diverse modifications or evolutionary adaptations that fit them to specific ways of life in their environment. Let's put a big old X to that. Only because, again, it's not going to be on the exam, but I understand how he came to these ideas. So again, he saw all this different life from around the world, and was convinced that the world is no longer, convinced that the world is not 6,000 years old. Put all that stuff together, this is what he came up with. So any questions about that side? All right, let's jump into his theory. Kind of scratch the surface, but let's really dive into his theory. Darwin's theory. Yeah, it is on this PowerPoint. I mentioned this earlier. I said he marinated on it for a bit. I didn't say how long. He spent 2 decades compiling and writing about evidence for evolution. Again, it's not like he just got back from this trip and was like, all right, hey guys, here's natural selection. Believe it or don't, I'm out. Right? No, he worked on it for a while. Meanwhile, there's this guy named Alfred Russel Wallace. You can click on that and download. If you download the PowerPoint, you can click on that and get a little bit more information about it if you want. And he was also a British naturalist doing field work in Indonesia. And then almost around the same time, he also conceived the hypothesis that was almost identical to his. So it's interesting to me because you can see, again, Indonesia, right? So it's similar situations to the Galapagos Islands. You've got bigger islands, smaller islands, and some of them are close together to allow certain organisms to go back and forth. Some of them, they're far enough away from the mainland to where it's hard for that to happen, but close enough to where it's not impossible. All the same things that, he found with the Galapagos. Anyway, again, not going to be on the exam, but you can look into it if you want. So his book on the origins of species by means of natural selection makes 2 proposals. Existing species descended from ancestral species, as I've said previously, and natural selection is the mechanism of evolution, as we said earlier. Those are the 2 proposals he made. I guess you should know that. I will put a little star next to this, because even though that was his proposal, it is worth noting, like I said at the very beginning of this chapter, that natural selection is not the only mechanism of evolution. It's just the big one that we talk about a lot. We'll also talk about the other ones. As a matter of fact, if you've already done the lab, you've already seen the other mechanisms, genetic drift and things like that. Anyway, any questions about this slide? All right. The idea of evolution generated predictions that have been tested and verified by over 150 years of research. So again, it's not like he just came up with this idea and everybody just said, okay, we're done, everything's explained. No, we've been doing research ever since then. And everything we've done supports this. So consequently, think about chapter 1. This is kind of a throwback to chapter 1. Scientists regard evolution by the means of natural selection as a theory. Right? It's not a hypothesis. A theory is broader in scope and tested more. It's a widely accepted explanatory idea. And also, again, just like this is everything we learned in chapter 1, it generates new hypotheses supported by a large body of evidence. This actually goes back, it's a good time to bring up that question on the last lab that a lot of people get wrong. So how do scientists test theories? You really got to think about what you're writing. Because I understand you're reading it, copy it, paste it, copy it, paste it. I know you're just trying to get the lab done. I was the same way as a student. But think about what you're writing. So how do scientists test theories? The number 1 wrong answer, actually the only wrong answer that a lot of people got was they make predictions. That's not testing a theory. So by the theory of evolution, I predict that humans will be, on average, 2 feet taller in 100 years. I just made a prediction based on the theory. Did I test that theory? No, I just made a prediction. So anyway, you do it, you test it, and that's how we test theories. So it's a good time to bring that in. So if you missed that question, now you know why. And also now you know how to fix it for partial credit. So any questions about this slide? All right, then your textbook goes on to give you a definition of evolution, or the theory of evolution specifically, which is that living species are descendants of ancestral species that were different from present day ones. I'm not going to ask you about that, especially considering, I like to focus on the fact that, yes, that's what evolution says, but evolution is happening now, right? So I don't know why everybody has to focus on, this is where we came from, because again, some people just don't want to believe that, and they don't, and that's fine. So forget that. Just know that it's happening now, and it's important the way it's happening now. That's why we get new viruses and bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. We'll talk about all that later too. Here's a good test question, and I doubt anybody remember because I know you probably haven't studied this yet. I mentioned it on Monday, but I know this is just a joke, But if this was evolution, this would not be evolution proposed by Darwin. This is supposed to be a duck face thing. I don't know if they still do that with selfies, or if you guys even remember what that was. But so this person, this is a duck face thing. Does anybody know? Can you guess who that would be? Like, which person we talked about? Who would suggest that as evolutionary? As evolution? I guess that's okay. I don't blame you. Again, you probably haven't studied it yet. We mentioned him. His name's Lamarck. So he was the one that suggested like giraffes got long necks because they stretched. They were stretching their necks. So then their offspring had longer necks. And then they grew stretching their necks. So their offspring had longer necks. So that's the thing there. Obviously, that won't be on the test. I'm not going to ask you about duck face on the exam. So anyway, any questions about the theory of evolution? Now let's get into the good stuff, in my opinion. The evidence of evolution. Oh, there's a book I have. If I had time, if this wasn't a 100 level class, I would have you guys read it. It's all about humans, how we're not like the most perfectly adapted organism out there. There's so many different flaws in our bodies, in our genomes, and all kinds of stuff. But anyway, let's talk about the evidence of evolution. For the people in person and not online, if you send me an email with this word, fossils, get some extra credit. Just any time today, say, hey, you said there that if I send you this word as extra credit, I would get it. So there you go.
Again, it's muffled.
That's okay. That was for that particular one was for the people online. I mean, in person. Anyway, evolution leaves observable signs, right? So we're getting into this idea of the evidence here. Biological evolution is left evidence. And if you click this link here, if you download the PowerPoint, and click that, there's a little short video you can watch about the evidence of evolution. I think this too. I think I turned that into a link. I think if you click the picture of that sign, it also will show you a short video. Anyway, where is this evidence found? It's found in fossils. So as you can imagine, we're about to learn a lot about fossils. It's found in today's organisms. So as you can imagine, I'm about to give you some of the evidence found in today's organisms. But yeah, you can click the sign too. So there's no need to write any of this down. This is just an introduction because we're going to talk about fossils. We're going to talk about today's organisms. Evidence from fossils. That's the first one we're going to talk about. Fossils, obviously, you know basically what they are. We've already talked about it earlier, but they document the differences between past and present organisms. So we can look at old stuff, look at new stuff, and compare them. Like, okay, this bone is bigger than this one when you go from this to this, right? Or this one's larger, this one's longer. You make all these comparisons. And it shows, obviously, and to us, this is no big deal because we've just lived this and we always knew it. But fossils show that many species have become extinct. So we don't see any T-Rexes running around, right? We see T-Rex fossils, but I have yet to see a living Tyrannosaurus Rex in person. I've seen them on plenty of movies and shows. But, yeah. So again, things have become extinct. Not a big deal for you guys, but back in the day, that was a new, groundbreaking idea. Your book also points out, when we're talking about fossils, that the soft parts of organisms decay rapidly. So usually it's only the hard parts that are rich in minerals that remain as fossils. Not that I'm going to ask you about that, but that just, it kind of shows or explains, well, why is it that we always find dinosaur bones? Why don't we find dinosaur bodies? And that's why. It should be common sense, but you book those out there anyway. So, again, before I took this class way back when someone told me fossil, again, my first thought was a T-Rex, the big skeleton. To me, that's what a fossil was, and that is what a fossil is. But I'm glad your book points this out. Not all fossils are actual remnants. And that's not going to necessarily be a test question, not directly like that, but I may give you a list of things and say which one of these is not a fossil, or which one is a fossil. So remember, it doesn't have to be like the actual bones or the actual remnants. It could be a cast, for example. This is a buried organism that has decomposed and left an empty mold filled by the minerals dissolved in the water. Not that I'm going to ask you that many details about a cast. I'm not. But if I ask you a question that says which one of these is a fossil, which one of these is not, you need to know what a cast is for that reason. So imagine, I don't know, you find something small and squishy, it dies, and it's in mud, and that mud eventually hardens, right? So even though the thing that's soft and squishy and died and decomposes and it's gone, you still have a perfect little mold of what it is, right? So that's not actual remnants of the thing, but you can learn a lot by the way it used to look by looking at the cast. Another one is imprints, such as footprints or burrows that remain after an organism decays. See if I can find that article I read recently. I think it's been since this semester. There was some river in Texas, and I guess they're having drought conditions, so the rivers run dry, and now you can see these footprints of dinosaurs, like millions of years old. Anyway, so that would be an example of a fossil. And then the interesting one to me, I think this is interesting because it's just so different than everything else, is coprolites. It's basically fossil, not basically, it is. It's fossilized feces. So, poop that's turned to rock, so to speak. Here's a picture of one. If you click on that picture, there's a short video you can watch. And it's really is short, and it's not educational, it's just kind of funny. Somebody's got one of these at a natural history museum, and they're like, hey, this is a fossil, and they're passing it around, everybody's holding it, and they think it's cool, because it really is a rock at this point. But then they tell them it's a coprolite, and they tell them what a coprolite is, and some people are like, ew, gross, poop. But it's old poop. So anyway, any questions about what fossils are? I'm not going to ask you what a coprolite is. I'm not going to ask you, to define an imprint or to define a cast. Again, if you get any questions, it's going to say, which one of these is a fossil? Or it could be a bunch of things that aren't fossils, and I'll say, which one of these is a fossil? That's how that question is going to go. And that brings us to this word. I'm sure you've heard it before. A paleontologist. That's a scientist who studies fossils. Now, any questions about this slide? I wish for lab we could just, I wonder if we could do that. Might change it up. I want to see if maybe the university could just pay for us to rent Jurassic Park and we just come in here and watch one of the Jurassic Parks for lab. We'll see. Anyway, so we talked about what fossils are. Because fossils are the big evidence, because that's what we find most of. But rarely, entire organisms, including the soft parts, have been encased in mediums that prevent decomposition. Your book gives some examples. So insects and amber's. So that's a great. Speaking of Jurassic Park, I don't know if you guys have seen the first one. It's that mosquito. They got some dinosaur blood. Then it landed on a tree, and then the thing got covered with sap. And then over millions of years, that sap turned into amber, right? So that's your real life example. That stuff does happen. Then there's some mammoths and bison and humans that have been found in bogs and then have been found frozen. There's all kinds of examples. So if that's interesting to you at all, you might look that up for independent work. Some really interesting stories of fully a woolly mammoth. To me, that's amazing that we found full intact woolly mammoths. They've been extinct for so long, or humans for that matter. Anyway, any questions about that side? All right. Actually, this will be the next attendance word. Ice. The word that I am circling and pointing an arrow to. It's the next attendance word. So here's just some pictures of what we're talking about, right? Here's a sedimentary fossil formed by minerals replacing the organic matter of a tree. We didn't even mention this earlier. But petrified wood. That's another example of a fossil. There's an imprint we talked about, right? So a footprint left by a dinosaur 120 million years ago. Here's the amber we're talking about, the Jurassic Park story. There's an actual bone, right? A fossilized bone. And again, that's what I always used to think of when I was a kid, or before I took this class. And then, of course, here we don't see the whole thing, but there's a frozen creature in there. A frozen woolly mammoth. So, now that we know about fossils, let's talk about the fossil record. And this picture's not from your textbook, it's from somewhere around here. I don't remember where. Actually, I don't even remember if I took it or if I Googled it. Either way, if you've driven anywhere, any interstates around here, you've seen something that looks a lot like this, right? I'm going to come back to that. What is the fossil record? It is the sequence of fossils as they appear in rock layers marking the passage of geologic time. So what you might not know about geology is you can see these layers going like this, right? So there's the road. So you can imagine this is horizontal, and that's kind of up at an angle, right? But it didn't always used to be like that. This used to be like that, right? So imagine this whole thing being shifted to where this was the top and this was the bottom. Can you guys picture that in your mind? Right? This thing twisted like that, like rotated to where this is the top and this is the bottom. So if you can imagine, even without being a geologist, if you find a fossil here, and then you find another fossil here, for those of you online, if you find a fossil at site A, and then you find a fossil at site B, which fossil is older? B, right? Because again, picture this, again, kind of rotated this way. So this A rock is a lot newer than the B rock, right? Everything like this is old stuff. And then you get layers of stuff added onto it, and added onto it, and added onto it. So basically dirt and mud and all that eventually turns to rock. So in a perfect world, you would have had geology before you had this class. But, you know, and you would have had chemistry before you had this class. And you would have had physics before you had this class. But that's a whole other story. So yeah, so even if you're not a geologist, you can just tell by where you find fossils that this thing is clearly older than this thing, right? Or as your book says, because younger strata are on top of older, the relative ages can be determined. So even without carbon dating and all this other fancy science, we can just say, all right, I found the fossil here, and then I found the fossil here at B, and then I found some at C and D, and I didn't find anything for a while, I found it at E. And then, and this is all hypothetical, but let's say they were all related. You could tell that, you know, this one's like really old, and it looks a lot different than the one that you found at D. But the one at D looked very close to the one at C, but different, which looked very close, but different than the one in B, which looked a lot different than the one at A, right? So again, that's basically how it works. It's a little bit more complicated, but they can tell by where they found it how old it is and how close in time those things were to each other. I actually wish I had taken geology, because probably a geologist could look at this and be like, oh yeah, that's the Permian era. Like they could probably just look at the colors and tell you what is what. Anyway, are there any questions about that side? All right, another important thing to mention about fossils, you know, if we're saying again, you know, the organism that we found at E looks very different than D. Why is that? Of course, it makes sense when I'm showing it to you, because E was a lot older than D. What I'm getting at here, Darwin acknowledged the same thing. Fossil record is incomplete. So a lot of times people who are against evolution, that's one of the things. Like, okay, if we came from this, where's the fossils in between this? Like, where's the proof? Well, the fossil record is incomplete. Why is it incomplete? Well, many organisms didn't live in areas that favored fossilization. So it's not like everything that died back in the day turned into a fossil, right? That was actually a relatively rare occurrence. Not everything turns into a fossil. So there's a lot of things that just never became fossils. Also, many fossils were in rocks that were later distorted or destroyed by geological processes. So again, like I said, the Appalachian Mountains used to be the tallest mountains in the world. So imagine if there were some fossils in those mountains, and as those mountains were just destroyed over time from erosion and different things, so were those fossils. Or, does anybody know the tallest mountain range now? Obviously, it's not the Appalachians anymore. What's the tallest mountain range now? In America, you would be correct, I think. But overall in the world, does anybody know? The Himalayas, right? That's where Mount Everest is. So the reason that, and it's also growing, that mountain range is growing. The reason that's growing is because India is still crashing into Asia, which we can't see it, but that's what's happening. India is still crashing into Asia. It's causing that to go up, and that's where you get the Himalaya mountains. Anyway, point being, if there's fossils in that area where India is still hitting and crashing into Asia, obviously they're getting destroyed. And then, of course, not all fossils are accessible to paleontology. So again, in a nutshell, first of all, not everything turned into a fossil. Second of all, some of the fossils that have been created have been destroyed. And third, there's fossils we still haven't gotten to yet and may never get to. So yes, the fossil record is incomplete, but there's reasons for that. Anyway, any questions about that slide? All right, next is the process of science. We'll skip it as we always do. Again, it's worth reading, especially this one. It's slightly interesting. What I love about this one, we're gonna have a throwback to it, and I give you the cliff notes, is to talk about looking at evolution and saying, where did whales come from? We know whales are mammals, and we know mammals are generally land-dwelling animals. So it's like, how did they go to the sea? And that's what this talks about. I'm not going to go through the whole thing because I'm not going to text you on it. But let's see, what's the part that will be not important for the test, but this is going to come back later. Results support their hypothesis. Oh yeah. So in the 60s, they had this hypothesis that whales were descendants of primitive wolf-like carnivores that have hooves. So think about it like if you can imagine like a wolf has like little pig hooves, right? That's what they said. That's what they thought whales came from. And they went through this long studies. What do they say? 20 years of discoveries, right? So a lot of evidence, and then pointed to the fact that yep, they were correct. I'm not saying that is correct. I'm saying their experiments and all their studies supported their hypothesis. I'm not going to test you on that, but that's going to come back later in this chapter. Anyway, there's a picture of what we're talking about. So that's the hooved wolf-like creature they said whales came from. All right. Also, I don't have time to talk about it. You should really look some of this stuff up. It's really interesting. Like whales and dolphins. One of them had a mutation in one of their genes, and that led to them just having little limbs again, because they don't have limbs anymore, right? These limbs went away over time, right? So they don't have those limbs. But some dolphin somewhere, I think, had some mutation, and it just boom had limbs again. So it wasn't that one. It's not always a gradual process, right? There was a mutation, and then boom, there's the limbs again. Of course, that probably won't last because it's not advantageous, but that's a whole different story. Whew. So are there any questions about evidence from fossils? Let's get into something a little bit more complicated, because most of us know what fossils are, right? Even if we weren't experts, you've all grown up hearing about fossils. But unfortunately, most people don't grow up hearing about homologies, so let's talk about that. Similarities resulting from common ancestry is known as a homology, which is where we have characteristics in ancestral organisms that have been altered over time as the descendants face different environmental conditions. So again, it's basically like things that are similar but different. And because of that, related species can have characteristics that have underlying similarities, yet different functions. Big thing we're going to talk about now is your forelimbs, right? We're all tetrapods, meaning we're all a type of vertebrates that have 4 limbs. But over time, things have changed a lot, right? What do bats use? What do you use your arms for manipulating things, right, and holding things? What does a horse use its 4 limbs for? Running, right? What's a bat use its 4 limbs for? Flying. What's a fish use its 4 limbs for? Swimming, right? So we all have these 4 limbs, but because of different environmental conditions, they do different things. Anyway, Darwin cited the similarities among vertebrate 4 limbs, like I was talking about, as evidence of common ancestry. There's a lot of other ones. We're just going to focus on 4 limbs for this discussion. Again, for us, we would call them arms. For a horse, for example, like I used earlier, we might call it a foreleg. For a dolphin, we would call it a flipper. For a bird or a bat, we would call it wings, right? All of these things. Let me back up. I didn't realize. I forgot. We're talking about mammals only. So when I said wings, obviously we're not talking about wings because we're talking about mammals, but still the same thing. They're focused on mammals, which is even closer related. So we have variations on the anatomical structure of ancestral organisms that over millions of years became adapted to different functions. So again, here we go. This picture is not from your book because it includes a frog and a bird, which are not mammals, and a lizard, which are not mammals. But still, you can see how the similarities between all these different animals on the forelimbs, right? The 1-boned humerus, and then the 2-bone forearm, even the same number, usually with some variation of the carpals and the metacarpals. And here's a picture from your book. It's a lot easier to look at, right? So you can see these similarities between a human forelimb and a cat and a whale and a bat. So completely different, and obviously it came from the same version, but it was just all modified as time went on to do different things. Anyway, that's just an example. Are there any questions about that? All right, what you do need to know about that, everything we've just been talking about, are called homologous structures. Anatomical similarities in different organisms are called homologous structures. So again, they're similar, so that's what makes them homologous structures. They have different functions, but are structurally similar. So penguins also a great example, right? Penguins What do they use their forelimbs for? Even though they're birds, they use it for swimming. Most other birds use it for flying. Because of that, if you were to look at a penguin forelimb versus the other forelimbs of birds, they would look slightly different. Similar, because they're homologous structures, but different. Any questions about that? All right, here's where it gets more interesting to me. Advances in molecular biology provide much deeper understanding of homologies. So we're no longer talking about homologous structures anymore. We're still looking at homologies, but we're not looking at structures. We're looking at molecules. So evolutionary history, or the evolutionary history of each species, is documented in the DNA inherited from its ancestral species. In other words, we can look at the DNA and look at genes, see how much they've changed as time goes along. There's actually one of the doctors in this room, or not this room, in this building, Dr. Rumpke, this is what he does. So he looks at the DNA to determine, all right, this species is more closely related to this species and less closely related to this species. And he can tell like how far along or how far back, how many millions of years it was where they diverged. But getting on to that, if two species have homologous genes that have sequences that match closely, the sequence must have been inherited from a relatively recent common ancestor. So that's back what I was saying. You look at the genes and say, all right, these two things are very closely related, unlike this thing and that thing, right? Which is this bullet point. The greater number of sequence differences, the more distant their last common ancestor. Because you have mutations, as we learned in the last chapter. Mutations accumulate over time. And this is a great example. How many of you know that you're supposed to eat vitamin C for health reasons, right? I'm sure you guys have all heard that. Did you know that you are one of the few mammals that need to eat vitamin C? Most people don't know that. Most mammals can make their own vitamin C. Humans have the gene to make vitamin C. But there was a mutation a while back, not even in humans, but prior to that, because all primates cannot make vitamin C. All primates all have the gene to make vitamin C, but we can't do it because it's broken. But there's no reason for that, there's no mechanism for that gene to just disappear, right? Having a broken gene is not a disadvantage, right? So the gene doesn't disappear, that allele doesn't disappear. So it's great evidence. And if we were just created to be perfect, why even have the broken gene to begin with? Anyway, moving forward. Molecular biology provides strong evidence that all life forms are related. And this is just stuff we talked about throughout the semester, but all use the same genetic language, right? DNA, RNA, it's a universal code. You can take the genes from any organism, in theory, and put it into another organism, and the cellular machinery will read it and produce those proteins. It's universal. In your book, give some examples that we've already talked about. Also, organisms as dissimilar as humans and bacteria share homologous genes inherited from a very distant common ancestor. So obviously we don't have many genes in common with bacteria, but there are some. And that's a decent independent work topic if you want. What are some of the genes that we do have in common with bacteria? Or what other organism you prefer to look at? Something worth looking into. So any questions about that? All right. Genetics, back here. There we go. Geneticists have uncovered hidden molecular homologies. I think I've already told you about one of them, like the thing about vitamin C, which gets to this bullet point. Organisms may retain genes that have lost their functions through mutations, even though the homologous genes in related species is fully functional. Again, the idea about vitamin C, right? We cannot make vitamin C, yet there's the gene to do so. We have the gene, it's broken, so we can't do it. Neither can most primates. Which suggests, again, there was some common ancestor that had a mutation to where they couldn't make vitamin C, and everything that came off of that common ancestor, which turned out to be primates, now cannot make vitamin C. Any questions about that side? But again, this whole idea of the vitamin C thing, that's just an example. So I'm putting it next to it. I'm not going to ask you specifically about vitamin C. But you can look that up for independent work too, some other options. Like what are some other things, some other molecular homologies? Like, do we have other genes that aren't functioning? This brings us to something called vestigial structures. which are remnants of features that served important functions in an organism's ancestors. So in a sense, even though I don't think your book is saying this, the last thing we talked about was kind of a vestigial gene. I mean, we have the gene, but for us, it serves no purpose. It's not making vitamin C. It's just kind of a waste of space on our chromosomes. But anyway, get back to vestigial structures. Your book gives some examples. I'm not going to ask you about the examples, but a small pelvis and the hind leg bones of ancient whales. Right? So if we look at ancient whales, they had no use for legs and a pelvis because they were swimming, but they still had the bones for it. Or if you look at cavefish, right? They still have eye remnants. They still have eye spots. They just don't work anymore, but they're there because way back when, evolutionarily, they had eyes. Or goosebumps. What causes goosebumps for humans? Physiologically, not emotionally. What gives people goosebumps? What makes you have goosebumps? Cold, yes. And for us, it does nothing. But if we were really, really hairy, hairier than that person, or hairier than me even, what happens is it kind of puts a little layer of air in between your fur and your skin. So it's like a little extra insulation. So back in the day, ancestrally speaking, that made sense, right? It helped. That's a vestigial structure. Also, another great independent work topic. What are some other vestigial structures? Either for humans or any other creature you want to look at. Anyway, any questions about vestigial structures? Those are just examples. I'm not going to ask you. Goosebump is the next word for attendance. Or words, I guess. Goosebumps. And that's what we're in. I guess when we come back on Friday, we'll finish it up with homologies. Now I'll either see you guys in lab or hopefully for your sake, I won't. I'm going to go start grading right now, or keep grading, I should say.